I never promised that I was going to recommend products with which there is no indication.
When you said...
And I know you've taken $855,000 from pharmaceutical companies, Senator. We have to acknowledge that there was a cause. We acknowledge that there was a benefit. We can't quantify either one because of the data chaos at CDC. And that's all I'm saying. And they think I'm being evasive because I won't make a kind of a statement that's almost religious in nature. Did it save 1 million lives? Well, there's no data to support that. Or maybe data, there's no study, that there's modeling studies, there's faulty data. I'm not going to sign on to something if I can't do it to a scientific certainty. It doesn't mean that I'm, anti-vax. It just means I'm pro-science. We are the sickest country in the world. That's why we have to fire people at CDC. They did not do their job. This was their job to keep us healthy.
Thank you,
and I need to fire some of those people to make sure this doesn't happen again.
September 4th, 2025, the Senate chamber roared like a battlefield. Reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder, cameras clicking in a relentless rhythm, their flashes slicing through the heavy air. Senators leaned across polished desks, whispering, strategies like generals on the eve of war. Every seat was filled, every glance sharpened. This was no ordinary hearing. It was the clash that had been brewing for months. The day Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would finally face his fiercest critics. On the Senate Finance Committee floor, as Kennedy entered, the room seemed to tighten. He carried no entourage, no triumphant smile, only the quiet weight of a man who had chosen a path others dared not walk. His reforms had already split Washington in half, unsettling pharmaceutical giants and rattling politicians who depended on their funding. For the establishment, Kennedy wasn't just controversial, he was dangerous. They meant to break him. Elizabeth Warren sat poised, pen tapping like a drumbeat of impatience. Ron Wyden's eyes followed Kennedy, with the cold precision of a prosecutor preparing his case. They were ready to pounce, ready to paint him as reckless, unscientific, and unfit. Yet beneath their stern facades was something else, the quiet fear that Kennedy might expose what they preferred to keep hidden. The murmurs swelled as Kennedy took his seat, a lone figure facing down an army. He adjusted his papers but didn't look down. His gaze swept the chamber, meeting cameras, senators, even the restless audience crammed into the back rows. It was the look of a man who knew this wasn't just another policy debate. This was theater, this was war, and every word he spoke would ripple far beyond the marble walls. The chair's gavel fell, silencing the room. A hush descended, the kind of silence that carries its own electricity. Every ear leaned forward. Every hand hovered above a keyboard, ready to record history. Kennedy drew a breath, steady and unhurried, as if he understood the entire nation was watching. Sparks hadn't yet flown, but the air already smelled of fire. And then came the hook that would define the day. What happened inside would ignite one of the most explosive health showdowns in modern history. But before the first question even landed, the stakes would rise higher than anyone in that chamber could have imagined. The silence in the chamber did not last long. Almost as soon as the gavel struck, the hearing turned into a referendum on America's health crisis. Numbers were thrown like grenades. 76.4%. That was the figure Kennedy laid before the Senate, the staggering percentage of Americans now living with chronic disease, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, families crushed by medical bills, lives shortened, dreams erased. The number didn't just represent statistics, it represented neighbors, parents, and children. The chamber could feel the weight of it, the truth that chronic illness had become the silent epidemic no one wanted to name. Kennedy's reforms were supposed to be his answer, a promise to restore transparency, demand accountability, and end the revolving door between regulators and pharmaceutical companies. His measures sought to examine vaccine schedules more closely, tighten oversight of drug approvals, and redirect funding toward prevention rather than profits. For his supporters, this was long overdue. For his critics, it was reckless heresy. And today, the critics had the microphone. Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, her voice sharp with urgency. She accused Kennedy of using public health as a political weapon, of sowing mistrust in vaccines when the nation could least afford it. She painted him as a figure pulling America backward, endangering years of scientific progress. Ron Wyden followed, layering on charges of irresponsibility, suggesting that Kennedy's reforms would leave millions vulnerable, especially children and the elderly. Their questions weren't just policy challenges, they were indictments, attempts to corner him as a dangerous provocateur. Kennedy, however, sat with the calmness of someone who knew the battlefield better than his opponents realized. To him, the issue wasn't about eroding trust, it was about restoring it. He spoke not of fear, but of betrayal. He argued that Americans had lost confidence, not because of reformers like him, but because they had seen corporations grow fat off subsidies and donations while their families grew sicker. He reminded the Senate that pharmaceutical giants had poured millions into campaign coffers, including those of his loudest critics. His tone was measured, not angry, but every word carried the edge of accusation. This was no longer a polite hearing. It was a collision between two visions of America's future, one clinging to the defense of the status quo, the other insisting that integrity and accountability were the only way forward. Viewers watching at home felt it, the crackling, sensed that history itself was swaying on the words spoken in that room. Kennedy leaned into the microphone, steady, deliberate. 76% of Americans are living with chronic disease. That is not a system in crisis. That is a system in collapse. And yet, instead of addressing the root causes, we keep handing blank checks to the very industries profiting from this misery. The words lingered like smoke searing through the chamber. Senators shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were painfully human. The question was clear. Would America choose to protect institutions or people? But before Kennedy could finish his defense, Elizabeth Warren's attack would set the chamber ablaze. Elizabeth Warren had built her career on the image of a fighter, a woman unafraid to take on Wall Street, corporations, or any powerful interest that threatened ordinary Americans. To millions, she was the professor-turned-senator who made a career out of exposing fraud, demanding accountability, and waving the banner of consumer protection. Her fiery cross-examinations in hearings had gone viral countless times, her voice slicing through CEOs and regulators like a blade. She was the progressive firebrand, populist warrior who prided herself on speaking for the voiceless. But inside the Senate chamber on September 4th, 2025, that image carried cracks. Behind her polished reputation, critics whispered about donations that had flowed into her campaigns from the very pharmaceutical companies she claimed to battle, while Warren had made a career of blasting corporate greed. The pharmaceutical industry had quietly supported her re-election campaigns, seeing her as a politician who thundered loudly but rarely pushed reforms that truly threatened their core profits. For Kennedy's supporters, this was the contradiction. The senator who fought for the people in sound bites but stood with the establishment. When the cameras dimmed, Warren sat upright at the committee table, her pen tapping against her legal pad, eyes locked on Kennedy with a glare that mixed determination with disdain. In her mind, she was about to dismantle a man she saw as reckless, a reformer willing to gamble with public health. But beneath that righteous anger was another truth. She was also defending a system that had kept her politically powerful, a system intertwined with pharmaceutical lobbying dollars and campaign promises. Across from her sat Ron Wyden, the senior senator from Oregon, older, calmer, but no less formidable. Where Warren attacked with passion, Wyden wielded policy expertise like a scalpel. He had spent decades in the Senate Finance Committee, rising to become one of its most influential voices on healthcare. He was respected, even admired for his deep knowledge of the system's inner workings, yet that respect came with shadows. Wyden's long career had been marked by an unusual closeness to the industries he regulated. Pharmaceutical firms had been steady contributors to his campaigns. Trade groups that profited from America's broken healthcare system counted him as an ally, His defenders would say this was simply the price of being a pragmatist, of working within Washington's realities. But to Kennedy and his allies, Wyden represented the rot, the revolving door. The quiet deals struck in back rooms while ordinary families suffered in silence. That day, Wyden's role was clear: to frame Kennedy's reforms as dangerous, irresponsible, and destabilizing. With his polished tone and measured cadence, he would present himself as the voice of reason, the seasoned statesman protecting Americans from chaos. But beneath the calm surface lay a deeper motive: protecting the powerful interests that had always been part of his orbit. Together, Warren and Wyden embodied the establishment's defense. She was the fiery prosecutor, he was the steady judge, and both were united in painting Kennedy as an extremist unfit to hold the reins of the nation's health policy. Their arguments would sound noble: protecting children, defending science, upholding stability. Yet every blow they delivered carried the fingerprints of industries whose billions depended on preserving the status quo. In that chamber, they looked like champions of public health. But outside those walls, critics saw something else: defenders of a machine that thrived on disease, dysfunction, and dependence. The louder they spoke of protecting Americans, the more their financial ties told another story. Kennedy knew it. He had studied their histories, their campaign contributions, the speeches that rang with populist fury, but were followed by votes that kept pharmaceutical profits intact. He knew the contradictions between Warren, the consumer advocate, and Warren, the recipient of pharma-linked donations. He knew the gap between Wyden, the policy wonk, and Wyden, the quiet ally of drug companies. And he knew that when the moment came, those contradictions would be his greatest weapon. The senators sharpened their questions like blades, preparing to carve Kennedy into pieces before the cameras. But Kennedy was not a man walking into an ambush unprepared. He was a man who had spent years battling the very forces these senators symbolized. He knew their strengths, he knew their weaknesses. And when the time was right, he was ready to strike. Where it hurt most? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did not walk into that Senate chamber as a stranger to conflict. His very name carried the weight of American history, a name bound to triumph and tragedy, resilience and sacrifice. Born into one of the nation's most storied families, Kennedy inherited not only the privilege of legacy, but the pain that came with it. His uncle, President John F. Kennedy, struck down by an assassin's bullet. His father, Robert F. Kennedy, Sr., murdered on the campaign trail, silenced before he could carry forward the vision of justice and equality. For most men, such a history would be paralyzing. For Kennedy, it became fuel, a reminder that truth and service demanded courage. Even in the face of relentless opposition, from an early age, Kennedy's life was marked by an unusual tension. The expectation of greatness paired with the constant shadow of loss. He could have chosen an easier path, one of quiet wealth and retreat from public life. Instead, he chose the fight. His career as an environmental attorney, taking on powerful polluters and corporate giants, showed his willingness to go where others feared. He became the lawyer who sued against contamination, who forced accountability when rivers were poisoned and communities left to suffer. It was never about headlines. It was about principle. That instinct carried him into the battle that defined him, his confrontation with pharmaceutical influence. For Kennedy, the issue was not simply science or data, it was about integrity. He believed that America's public health institutions had been captured by corporate interests, their trust, compromised by the very companies they were meant to regulate. To say such things was to invite ridicule, and ridicule came swiftly. Media outlets branded him anti-science, controversial, dangerous. Former allies distanced themselves. Even family members sometimes questioned his stance. Yet Kennedy did not waver. He carried the bruises of criticism with the same resilience that had carried his family through assassinations and loss. The personal sacrifices were immense. Invitations stopped coming. Former friends turned into critics. Every hearing, every public appearance became a gauntlet of scorn. He endured headlines mocking him, television hosts painting him as a relic of conspiracy. For Kennedy, the cause was larger than reputation. He believed Americans deserved answers about chronic illness, about vaccine safety, about the ballooning profits of companies that seemed untouchable. He did not claim to have all the solutions, but he demanded honesty. And in a city built on doublespeak, honesty was often treated as heresy. The image of Kennedy as controversial became both a curse and a shield. To the establishment, it meant he could be dismissed, caricatured, reduced to a soundbite. But to ordinary Americans, parents worried about their children's health, families crushed by medical bills, workers exhausted by chronic conditions, his outspokenness became a lifeline. He spoke the words they felt, but rarely heard in Washington, that health was not a commodity, that dignity could not be traded for donations. The system itself was broken. What made Kennedy compelling was not perfection, but persistence. He had stumbled in life, faced personal demons, endured setbacks, but each time he returned to the public arena, scarred yet unbowed. That persistence made him both dangerous and magnetic. Senators who mocked him privately knew that his words resonated. With millions outside the Beltway, every attack against him risked strengthening his base of support. So when Kennedy took his seat on September 4th, he carried more than a policy agenda. He carried the legacy of a family that had bled for American ideals. He carried the scars of years spent in the wilderness, branded and ridiculed, yet never silenced. He carried the quiet hope of families who saw in him not a politician, but a fighter willing to endure the fire on their behalf. The Senate chamber could not contain all of that weight, but those who looked closely could see it in his posture, in the steady calm of his eyes. He was not there for theater, though theater would inevitably unfold. He was there to do what Kennedys had always done at their best, to confront power, no matter the cost. And it was that history, that mixture of legacy, sacrifice, and resilience, that made the coming clash inevitable. Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden were not just debating a policy reformer. They were facing a man shaped by tragedy, hardened by sacrifice, and prepared to risk everything for a cause he believed in. The cameras were rolling. The questions were sharpened as Warren leaned in with her first attack. Kennedy's response wasn't just personal, it was historic. The air in the Senate chamber thickened as Elizabeth Warren adjusted her microphone, her expression sharpened to a blade. She wasted no time. "Mr. Secretary," she began, her voice rising above the hum of cameras and rustling papers. "Your so-called reforms would mean restricted access to life-saving vaccines for millions of Americans. Children, seniors, the most vulnerable among us all put at risk because you want to politicize healthcare." The accusation landed like a slap across the room. A ripple of murmurs surged from the back rows. Warren leaned forward, her pen stabbing the air with each word, as if she were cross-examining a hostile witness in a courtroom. "What gives you the right," she pressed, "to gamble with the health of American families for the sake of your crusade?" Kennedy did not flinch. His hands remained folded on the desk, his gaze steady. When he spoke, his tone was calm, even gentle, a striking contrast to Warren's cutting cadence. "Senator," he said evenly, "nothing in these reforms restricts access. What they do is demand transparency and accountability. The American people deserve to know why, despite record spending, we face record levels of chronic disease. That isn't politics, that is truth." But Warren was relentless. She cut him off mid-sentence, her voice rising sharper. "Truth," she echoed with a hint of mockery. "Version of truth undermines decades of medical consensus. It feeds doubt, and doubt costs lives." The chamber buzzed with tension, senators shifting in their seats, staffers whispering furiously behind them. Reporters typed at lightning speed, each sentence a potential headline. The clash had become more than a debate over policy. It was a duel of worldviews, each word echoing far beyond the marble columns. That was when Ron Wyden entered the fray. The senior senator leaned in, his tone less fiery than Warren's but no less forceful. "Mr. Secretary, I'll ask you plainly," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Are you politicizing health? Because from where I sit, your proposals threaten to erode public trust in the very institutions charged with protecting our people." The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Camera swung to Kennedy, lenses zooming in on his face. The moment called for either retreat or defiance. Kennedy chose neither. He answered with the same measured cadence. But a steel edge had entered his tone. "What politicizes health," he replied, "is when corporations fund the very watchdogs meant to regulate them. What politicizes health is when campaign donations outweigh scientific data. I am not undermining trust, Senator. I am exposing why trust has been lost." The words hit differently, not as a defense, but as an indictment. A hush spread, broken only by the distant clicks of cameras. Warren shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Wyden's lips tightened into a thin line. They had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger. Instead, Kennedy offered poise, and in that poise, power. Yet beneath his calm exterior, the pressure was building. He leaned slightly closer to the microphone now, his voice firming. "For too long, this chamber has confused loyalty to corporations with loyalty to the American people. That ends today." The clash grew sharper. Warren interrupted again, her voice nearly trembling with intensity, insisting his reforms would open the door to chaos. Wyden followed, accusing Kennedy of inviting conspiracy into governance. Each attack layered upon the last. But with every exchange, Kennedy's presence grew larger, his words cutting through the din like a steady drumbeat. The drama was no longer one of equals. It was aggression colliding with composure, fury crashing against calm resolve. The chamber had become a theater of contrasts, Warren's sharp staccato versus Kennedy's steady rhythm, Wyden's polished. Authority against Kennedy's piercing simplicity. And then came the moment no one had anticipated. Kennedy straightened, his voice dropping low, deliberate, almost surgical. His next words would not only answer his critics, but pierce the very foundation of their arguments. Then, one devastating moment, Kennedy shifted the entire balance of power. For a long-stretched moment, the chamber simmered in tense silence. Warren's glare cut across the room, Wyden's question still hovering in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every camera, every microphone, every eye fixed on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he had been calm until now measured, restrained. But suddenly, his fingers tapped once on the stack of papers before him, and the rhythm of the hearing shifted. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a tone that forced the room to lean in. 76.4% of Americans, he said, pausing for effect, live with chronic disease. Yes. The words were not shouted, but they landed like a gavel slamming down. A murmur rippled through the audience. Kennedy let the number breathe, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the chamber. "That's 3 out of every 4 citizens in this nation," he continued, his cadence slow, deliberate. "Children with asthma, teenagers with autoimmune disorders, adults buried under diabetes, heart disease, cancer, families drowning in medical debt because their loved ones are sick. 76.4%. He stopped again, letting the silence do the work. The only sound was the rapid clattering of journalists' keyboards. "And you want to talk about politics?" His tone sharpened now, like a blade unsheathed. "While this country suffers, while families are torn apart by illness, your focus is whether I'm making this partisan. No, senators. What is partisan is pretending this crisis doesn't exist." Warren shifted in her chair, frowning. But Kennedy wasn't finished. In fact, he was just beginning. He picked up a single sheet of paper from his stack, held it at eye level, and then placed it back down with precision, as if each gesture carried meaning. "I've reviewed the data. I've seen the numbers your committees ignore. I've traced the money that explains why." The murmurs grew louder now, spilling from the back rows toward the center. Wyden leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Warren raised her chin, defiant. But Kennedy turned directly toward them both. "Senator Warren, Senator Wyden." He spoke their names slowly, like a prosecutor naming defendants. "You accuse me of politicizing health? Yet both of you have accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies, directly, repeatedly, year after year." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Reporters froze, hands hovering above their keyboards. as if afraid to miss the next word. Warren stiffened visibly, her lips parting in disbelief. Wyden's eyes darted toward his aides. But Kennedy pressed forward. So tell me, when you defend these corporations, when you dismiss the data in front of us, whose health are you really protecting? It's the American people's or the donors? Who keep your campaigns alive? The air snapped like an electric charge. The chamber was no longer an arena of polite debate. It had transformed into a courtroom, and Kennedy had just flipped the tables. Senators who moments ago projected dominance now looked cornered under the fluorescent lights. Kennedy's voice grew steadier, louder, echoing against the marble walls. I am accused of sowing doubt, but the doubt didn't start with me. Started when families watched loved ones get sicker despite following every prescription. It started when regulators ignored red flags. It started when politicians in this very room, put corporate loyalty ahead of public health. His eyes locked with Warren's. She opened her mouth as if to respond. But Kennedy raised a finger slightly, not rudely, but with the authority of a man unwilling to be silenced. The gesture alone drew a low gasp from the audience. I will not be interrupted, he said firmly, the tremor of frustration now coloring his words. Not while 76% of Americans are living this nightmare. The chamber erupted, aides whispering frantically, journalists whispering, the buzz of disbelief spreading like wildfire. Even senators who had stayed silent leaned uncomfortably. Sensing that the balance of power had tilted, Kennedy let the noise swell before. Continuing, his voice dropping again to a near whisper that carried farther than a shout. This isn't about me. This isn't about politics. This is about truth. And truth doesn't bend for donors. Truth doesn't bow to lobbyists. Truth doesn't care whether it makes you uncomfortable. He let that linger. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. And then, with perfect timing, Kennedy delivered the blow that sealed the moment. He leaned forward, his glare unflinching, his tone icy. You call me dangerous because I ask questions? But what is truly dangerous, he said, sweeping his gaze across the panel, is pretending the crisis isn't real. Dangerous is taking money from the very corporations profiting off our sickness. Dangerous is standing in this chamber and calling it politics, while 76% of Americans suffer. The chamber fell still, the kind of silence that comes after an explosion. Even Warren seemed momentarily stunned, her hands clutching the desk as though steadying herself. Wyden cleared his throat but said nothing. The usual confidence, the polished rhetoric, had evaporated under the weight of Kennedy's words, and Kennedy knew it. He let the silence stretch, savoring it. His hand hovered near the microphone, not as a nervous tick, but as a statement. I control this moment now. The audience was no longer breathing with a Warren or Wyden. They were breathing with him. Every pause, every glare, every deliberate syllable. It all belonged to Kennedy. In that chamber, the roles had inverted. The supposed witness had become the prosecutor. The senators, once the aggressors, were on the defensive. The hero versus villain framing was no longer abstract. It was alive, playing out in real time. Kennedy had cast himself as the truth-teller, and his adversaries as the corrupted gatekeepers. The tension reached its peak as Kennedy leaned back. In his chair at last, exhaling softly, his words echoing even after he had stopped speaking. The room did not immediately move forward. It lingered there, suspended, caught in the gravitational pull of what had just unfolded. Then, slowly, conversations began to stir again. Murmurs spread like fire through dry brush. Aides scribbled notes. Cameras zoomed closer. Senators whispered nervously to their staffers. Their polished veneers cracked under the weight of Kennedy's counterattack. But Kennedy didn't move. He sat still, eyes fixed straight ahead, so daring anyone to challenge him now. And while the chamber trembled with the aftershocks of his words, one truth became unmistakable. The balance of power had shifted. Yet what no one inside those marble walls fully grasped not yet was that the hearing was only the spark. The real detonation, the one that would ripple far beyond the Capitol, was waiting outside. Kennedy glanced briefly at the cameras. lips tightening into the faintest suggestion of a smirk. But outside these marble walls, he said, voice low and ominous, the real explosion was just beginning. The hearing ended, but the battle was only beginning. Outside the chamber, reality fractured into millions of screens, posts, and sound bites. Within minutes, Kennedy's searing words ricocheted across the digital landscape, TikTok flooded with clipped moments of him staring Warren down. Twitter, or X, as it now branded itself, exploded with hashtags, hashtag Kennedy vs. Warren, hashtag health over politics, hashtag 76%. The soundbite that detonated most violently was just 9 words long. 76.4%, and you want politics? That line looped endlessly, stitched into TikToks with dramatic music. Remixed into reels where creators added captions like, finally someone said it, or the truth they didn't want out. On YouTube, reaction videos shot up by the hour, each thumbnail plastered with wide-eyed shock and bold text, Kennedy destroys Warren. Cable news networks scrambled to keep up. Some anchors framed it as a courageous stand, Kennedy refusing to bow to the political machine. Others dismissed it as reckless grandstanding, accusing him of playing to conspiracy rather than policy. Yet even as pundits split along familiar lines, one fact became undeniable. America was paying attention. For families weighed down by chronic illness, the moment resonated like a lightning strike. Parents caring for children with asthma or autism logged on to share their pain. Veterans living with lingering health crises added their voices. He's right. One viral post read, we're living this every day, and they want to argue. Politics. Another from a mother in Ohio gained over 200,000 likes. I don't care what side you're on. 3 out of 4 Americans are sick. Someone needs to do something. But the backlash was equally fierce. Pharmaceutical spokespeople quietly pushed out statements about misrepresentation and oversimplification. Loyal defenders of Warren and Wyden accused Kennedy of cheap theatrics. Editorials appeared. Overnight, some calling him a dangerous demagogue. Others hailing him as a whistleblower silenced too long. In living rooms across the country, though the debate felt less like politics and more like something personal, families who had never tuned into a Senate hearing before were replaying the clips. Watching Kennedy slam down the figure of 76% again and again, for many it felt like a validation of what they had been screaming into the void for years, that sickness had become America's shadow pandemic, and that no amount of rhetoric could disguise it. Even Kennedy's critics admitted, often reluctantly, that his words had stuck. The rawness of his delivery, the way he named Warren and Wyden directly, the way he refused interruption, it had cut through the noise in a way few political moments ever did. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was confrontation. By evening, late-night comedians were riffing on the clash, one joking, forget cage matches, let's just have Senate hearings. Kennedy came in swinging like Rocky. Memes spread. Faster than official statements, images of Kennedy slamming a gavel with captions like 76% Senator. Warren and Wyden, usually in control of their media narratives, suddenly found themselves on defense. And yet beyond the entertainment, there was something heavier unfolding. Polling firms reported a sudden spike in voter interest around health. Reform talk radio lit up with callers demanding accountability. At rallies and community centers, Kennedy's words were quoted verbatim, as if they were already etched into political scripture. It was not just the media spectacle. It was the ripple. The moment it tapped into something raw, something that lived far beyond the Capitol. And yet for all the noise, all the hashtags, all the viral clips and breaking news, Chirons. One thing was clear. Kennedy's counterattack wasn't simply about shaming to senators. It was a lesson whispered in every replay, carried in every share, repeated in every meme, because beyond the noise, Kennedy's words carried a truth America could not ignore. When the dust of the hearing settled, what lingered was not just the sound of raised voices or the sight of furrowed brows. It was the echo of something deeper, a question about who, in the end, America's institutions truly served. Kennedy had walked into the chamber as a lightning rod, a figure branded controversial, a man many expected to falter under the weight of hostile fire. But he walked out having reframed the clash into something larger than a partisan spectacle. "This is not left versus right," he told reporters in the hallway, his voice still calm despite the storm behind him. "This is people versus corruption, families versus profiteering, health versus politics." And with those words, the narrative shifted. What Warren and Wyden had tried to pin as radical, Kennedy reframed as universal. He wasn't speaking only to Democrats or Republicans. He was speaking to parents caring for sick children, to workers battling diabetes, to veterans living with chronic pain. He was speaking to the 76% who carried the weight of illness on their shoulders while watching corporations record record profits. In that reframing, arrogance crumbled. Warren's sharp interruptions and Wyden's polished rebukes now seemed less like strength and more like desperation, the establishment defending its walls. Kennedy, for all his flaws, embodied something more enduring, the dignity of refusing. To be silenced, his story woven into this moment made the lesson sharper. The son of a family defined by tragedy, scarred by loss, mocked as an outsider even in his own party, here he was, daring to say what millions whispered. His resilience wasn't polished. It was scarred and imperfect. But that imperfection made him human, relatable, believable. The broader reflection came swiftly. If America could not face the truth of its collapsing health, what else was it refusing to confront? If 76% of the nation could be suffering while politicians argued over optics, what did that say about the country's priorities, its values, its very identity? Commentators asked it aloud. Voters felt it in their bones. And Kennedy's role crystallized not as a savior, but as a flawed reformer, brave enough to risk ridicule, steady enough to stand alone, bold enough to put service above profit. The hearing had been framed as a clash over vaccine reform, but in truth, it became a mirror. It showed America what it had become, a nation drowning in illness, distracted by partisan combat and hungry for voices that placed people above politics. The reflection was uncomfortable, even painful. But it was necessary, because in the end, Kennedy's confrontation wasn't about one policy or one scandal. It was about reminding America of its deeper truth, that dignity speaks louder than arrogance, that health is worth more than campaign checks, that service means nothing if it doesn't serve the people. And as the chamber emptied and the headlines spread, that truth remained fragile, defiant, undeniable. Because sometimes the loudest room in Washington still cannot silence the quiet power of truth.